Welcome to The Debate. You know, when we analyze a physical crime scene, we generally walk in with this expectation of, well, absolute empirical clarity. There is a fingerprint on a glass, or there isn't.
Right, right.
There is a specific timeline of events, a clearly identified weapon. It's fundamentally objective. The physical evidence either places someone in the room or it simply doesn't.
Exactly. It operates in a binary state, guilt or innocence, a sequence of tangible facts that eventually lead us to a solid conclusion.
Yeah, but then you encounter a narrative like the 2026 film adaptation of Verity, and suddenly that forensic clarity completely disintegrates. I mean, we are no longer looking at a physical house, we are looking at the crime scene of the human mind.
Oh, I like that framing.
Right? Because the central piece of evidence isn't a physical weapon, it is a manuscript, and that demand for objective truth that we all crave, it just descends into utter psychological chaos. So today, we are deconstructing Verity not merely as a thriller, but as a profound study of an internal psychological system that has become entirely, hopelessly tangled up. We are going to view this labyrinth of deception through the framework of internal family systems, or IFS.
And I think it is the perfect framework for this film, because what IFS essentially proposes is that the human mind isn't just one monolithic entity, It's composed of multiple distinct parts.
Yeah.
You can think of it like an internal boardroom. You have protectors trying to keep you safe, managers trying to run your daily life, firefighters reacting to emergencies. And deep down, you have these wounded, vulnerable parts called exiles. Ideally, all of these parts are led by a core, compassionate self. But in Verity, the lines between reality and fiction are obliterated precisely because we are watching characters whose internal boardrooms have completely overthrown that core self.
Which brings us to the core disagreement we're exploring today. What is the true nature of Verity Crawford's infamous manuscript within her own psychological system? I will be arguing that the manuscript is a literal confession. It is the terrifying truth, the record of an out-of-control firefighter part that completely hijacked Verity's self and committed horrific acts.
And I take the opposing perspective on this. I argue that the manuscript is a complete fiction. It is a highly specific purging exercise utilized by Verity's manager part to safely vent toxic thoughts and maintain her sanity. And if that's true, well, it means her final letter reveals a true tragic reality, which is that she is entirely a victim.
So let's break down exactly how these parts operate in Verity's case, starting with my perspective. I view Verity as representing an extreme, deeply pathological case where the core self is entirely sidelined. In the IFS framework, firefighter parts are purely reactive.
Purely reactive, right?
Exactly. I mean, imagine a literal firefighter. If your house is burning down, the firefighter doesn't care about water damage to your expensive rug. They just take an axe to the door and flood the place to extinguish the immediate threat. Firefighters, in our minds, act impulsively to extinguish psychological pain, regardless of the collateral damage.
Okay, but what is the specific fire they're trying to put out in Verity's system then?
Well, the fire is triggered by a profound, wounded exile. Verity harbored a part of herself that was utterly terrified of abandonment. A part obsessed with maintaining her husband Jeremy's exclusive, undivided love. When her children were born, they weren't viewed as family. They became a systemic threat to that exclusivity.
That is incredibly dark.
It is. So my position is that the manuscript is the ultimate, terrifying voice of her darkest firefighter part. It documents exactly how this part neutralized those perceived threats to protect her psychological survival. The manuscript isn't some creative writing exercise. It is a terrifying assertion of this firefighter's absolute power and the horrific, literal reality of what it did to her own child to secure Jeremy's love.
I see. Well, I come at it from a completely different way. I look at Verity's outward existence before the tragedy, and it completely contradicts the idea of an unhinged, impulsive firefighter running the show. She was a glamorous best-selling author, she was a meticulously perfect wife, and by all external accounts, a model mother.
Yeah, externally.
Right, but maintaining that level of external perfection day in and day out requires an incredibly dominant, highly trained manager part. If a manager is the CEO of the psyche, Verity's CEO was working overtime.
Well, to keep the system functional, sure.
Precisely. Managers work proactively to control the environment and keep those resentful, wounded exiles deeply hidden so the person can function in polite society. But here is the catch. If Verity had those dark, toxic thoughts, and as a thriller writer, her literal profession was dwelling in darkness, her manager needed a highly structured way to handle them.
Okay, I follow.
The manuscript was that tool. It was a fictional container, a pressure valve designed by the manager to safely vent those abhorrent impulses onto paper so they would never leak out and destroy her real life. Therefore, the letter discovered at the end reveals the actual truth. Verity never harmed her children. The manuscript was an elaborate fiction, and she is the victim of a catastrophic misunderstanding.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's really look at the physical evidence she left behind. If we're defining this manuscript merely as a manager's purging exercise, why does it cross the line into documenting specific, actionable harm against her own child?
Well, because it's a purge.
But there is a profound difference between a writer conceptually exploring dark themes, like plotting a murder mystery, and a mother writing a detailed chronological blueprint of child abuse that perfectly aligns with the real-world tragedies that followed.
I mean, I hear you.
Doesn't the sheer extremity of the violence, the meticulous methodology of it, suggest a firefighter part asserting real-world power rather than a manager just doing some, psychological house cleaning?
I understand why the sheer detail of the manuscript feels like a confession. Absolutely. But the extreme nature of the violence is exactly the point of a psychological purge. A manager part isn't going to half-measure a containment strategy for a deeply disturbed exile. Imagine you are trying to build a vault for radioactive material. You don't build it out of drywall. You build it out of 3 feet of lead.
Okay, that's a fair analogy.
Right, if the exile's fear of abandonment is generating incredibly dark, resentful thoughts toward the children, the manager has to build a conceptual vault thick enough to hold it.
So by writing the absolute worst-case scenario?
Yes. By writing the most vile, unforgivable impulses, she traps those impulses on the page. It is the ultimate psychological pressure valve. In fact, I would argue the extremity proves it's a fiction. Think about the mechanics of a real-world cover-up.
Go on.
If it were a literal confession of a firefighter acting out and committing actual murder, the manager who wants to preserve the external life at all costs would have immediately destroyed the evidence to protect the system. The fact that it was kept as a writing exercise, hidden but physically preserved, points directly to its utility as an ongoing, functional tool for her sanity.
Hold on. I want to challenge that. Because that relies heavily on the assumption that the manager retained control of the system. Let me stop you there, because I want to make sure I'm grasping this mechanism. In heavily traumatized or fully blended systems, don't firefighters often overpower managers completely?
They can, yes.
Once the crisis hits, the CEO gets locked out of the boardroom. The preservation of the manuscript isn't a sign of functional utility. What if it's a trophy?
A trophy?
Yeah. It's the firefighter's monument to its own success in securing Jeremy's love. The manager didn't destroy it because the manager was no longer in charge.
That's a compelling argument, I'll give you that. But have you considered how that interpretation completely recontextualizes the actions of her husband, Jeremy? Because if we assume the absolute truth, it forces us into a highly problematic reading of Jeremy's psychology.
How so? Walk me through Jeremy's internal system if the manuscript is a fiction.
Well, if the final letter is the truth, meaning Verity was essentially doing an extreme journaling exercise that Jeremy found and misunderstood, then Jeremy's entire persona throughout the story is a terrifying illusion. Throughout the film, Jeremy projects what IFS would call self-energy. He appears calm, caring, compassionate, and stable. He is the anchor.
He definitely presents that way.
But if he tried to murder his wife over a misunderstood writing exercise, then his self is a complete facade. He isn't led by compassion. He is operating from a caretaker-manager part. And that caretaker-manager masks a deeply dark reality. Jeremy is a man capable of brutal, cold-blooded violence the very second his idealized image of his family is challenged.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because I think it applies a very conventional moral framing to what is actually a complex, systemic psychological reaction. Let's trace his actions, if the manuscript is true.
Okay.
If Verity did in fact murder their child, then Jeremy isn't a cold-blooded villain killing his wife over a misunderstanding. He is a psychological immune system reacting to a lethal virus.
An immune system? I mean, that's a strong way to put it.
Exactly. Think about how the body responds to a deadly pathogen. It triggers a massive, overwhelming fever to burn the virus out. When Jeremy reads that manuscript and realizes his wife is a literal predator who killed their child, his own system experiences a total existential shock. The foundation of his reality collapses.
Right, but his reaction is...
His extreme actions at the end of the story, choking her, staging the accident, are his own cold, punishing firefighter emerging. This part steps in to protect whatever is left of the idealized family system from a literal proven threat. And what happens once the threat is neutralized?
He goes back to normal.
Yes. That firefighter immediately retreats back behind his mild caretaking exterior. The fever breaks. It is a devastating, horrifying response. But internally, it is a perfectly logical, systemic reaction to a lethal threat.
I see the logic in the immune system analogy, but I have to push back on the mechanics of it. A firefighter, as we established earlier, is highly reactive. It acts in the heat of the moment to extinguish immediate pain.
Sure.
But Jeremy's actions are sustained over a massive period of time. The systematic locking away of his wife, the daily maintenance of this horrific silent status quo in the house, that requires a manager's cold precision, not a firefighter's impulsive acts. If the letter is true, Jeremy used the manuscript as a convenient, rationalized excuse to punish Verity. He becomes the ultimate calculating executioner. And honestly, this is exactly why Lowen, our protagonist, is so magnetically pulled into this incredibly chaotic system.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking this leap. If Jeremy is this calculating executioner, masking a dark protector behind a caretaker facade, why doesn't Lowen run screaming in the opposite direction?
Oh, because she can't.
She doesn't just wander into the Crawford house. She becomes obsessed with it. How do you view Lowen's integration into this incredibly toxic system?
Because her internal system is uniquely primed to resonate with that exact frequency of darkness. Lowen is carrying immense exile's burdens. Let's look at her state when she enters the house. She is completely raw from the recent traumatic death of her mother. She is profoundly isolated and she is financially desperate.
True. She's incredibly vulnerable.
Exactly. In IFS, exiles hold our deepest vulnerabilities and our most agonizing traumas. Because of her unhealed pain, she is hypersensitive to the dark vibrations in the Crawford house. When she discovers Verity's manuscript, it isn't her rational, balanced self that makes the decision to keep reading.
It's another part entirely.
Yes. A part of her, what we might call a toxic curiosity part, blends with her completely. It drives her to read the manuscript, to obsess over it, not because she wants to help anyone or seek justice. She reads it because the manuscript confirms her own exile's worst fears about human nature. It validates her internal, subconscious belief that the world is inherently dangerous, that mothers can be literal monsters, and that love is ultimately destructive.
Wow.
She projects her own desperate need for survival onto the text. She needs the manuscript to be true, to validate her own trauma.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently when we look at how Lowen's reaction mirrors the audience's reaction. I don't think Lowen aligns with the manuscript purely out of toxic curiosity or a desire to confirm her worst fears. Actually, I think believing the manuscript satisfies the manager parts of Lowen's psyche, and by extension, it satisfies the manager parts of the audience watching the film.
Really? How does believing in a horrific murder satisfy a manager part? That sounds counterintuitive.
Because manager parts crave order, control, and predictability above all else. They want a just world where cause and effect make logical sense. Think about it. If Verity's manuscript is the objective truth, then Verity is definitively a monster.
Right. It simplifies things.
Yes. And if she is a monster, the evil in the house is identifiable. It can be boxed up and quantified. It means Jeremy is a victim who took necessary, albeit brutal, protective action. And most importantly for Lowen, it means she is completely justified in taking Verity's place in Jeremy's life.
Ah, convenience.
Believing the manuscript provides profound psychological safety. It establishes a neat, binary universe: good and evil, guilt and innocence. Isn't Lowen's alignment with the manuscript and the audience's desperate desire to believe it just a necessary psychological mechanism to establish order in a terrifyingly chaotic situation?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Believing the manuscript might offer a superficial, fleeting sense of order, but it requires a complete denial of human complexity.
Well,
It requires Lowen and the viewer to look at a highly stylized, creatively written document produced by a professional thriller writer and say, yes, this is literal, objective reality. Case closed. The audience members who cling to the manuscript are prioritizing immediate comfort over intellectual honesty.
I wouldn't call it intellectual dishonesty.
But conversely, the audience members who believe the final letter, who believe Verity is a victim of her own psychological purging tool, are operating from their vigilant parts.
The vigilant parts being the ones that expect deception at every turn? The parts holding the magnifying glass?
Precisely. A vigilant part fundamentally believes that things are never as simple as they appear on the surface. By choosing to believe the letter, you are forced to accept a much more terrifying, ambiguous reality. That Jeremy, the seeming paragon of self-energy and kindness, is actually a lethal manipulator.
Right. And worse, that Lowen has unwittingly become an accomplice to murder by aligning with him. The vigilant part feels a paradoxical safety in this darkness. Its internal logic is, if I expect the absolute worst of people, if I never trust the calm exterior, I can never be fooled or caught off guard. It's a safety based entirely on perpetual suspicion. But the heavy cost of that safety is a permanent, agonizing distrust of human nature.
Which brings us to the ultimate tragedy of the story's psychological landscape, both for the characters trapped in the house and for the viewer experiencing it. This intense polarization between seeking a just world by believing the manuscript and seeking vigilant safety by believing the letter highlights a complete and utter absence of self-leadership.
Yes, that is the crux of it. In the IFS framework, the ultimate goal of therapy is unblending. It is the conscious process of separating the core self from these extreme protectors, managers, and firefighters.
Right.
The core self possesses the capacity for calmness, clarity, and compassion. Crucially, the self can hold ambiguity without panicking. It can look at a complex situation and not rush to a binary judgment.
And the tragedy of Verity is that neither Verity nor Jeremy nor Lowen ever achieve that unblending. They are entirely consumed. Verity is consumed either by her obsession with power and creation, if you believe the letter, or by a murderous firefighter, if you believe the manuscript.
Exactly.
Jeremy is entirely consumed by a possessive, punishing need to control his family's image and neutralize threats. Lowen is consumed by her desperation for salvation and attachment. They are all interacting purely through their protector parts. It's just a house full of armor clashing together. They are perpetually lying to each other and to themselves.
And crucially, the film offers absolutely no unburdening. It ends without giving any of the characters a moment of true clarity, healing, or revelation. The trauma is permanently locked in, and that psychological gridlock transfers directly to the audience. We leave the experience with our own internal systems completely triggered, debating exactly what we're debating today.
Because true self-safety would require us, as the audience, to step back and accept a profound ambiguity. To view this story through the lens of self-leadership means recognizing that both the letter and the manuscript are manipulative tools created by protector parts. They are both artificial constructs designed to control a narrative and secure survival.
Yeah.
We don't actually need an absolute objective truth to be okay. We can observe how these characters were systematically destroyed by their inability to unblend, and we can find our safety in that psychological awareness, rather than in desperately picking a side to soothe our own managers.
But the sheer brilliance of the narrative design is that it makes that kind of neutral observation almost impossible. Colleen Hoover built a perfect psychological trap. The structure of the story is engineered to bypass our rational, calm self and speak directly to our own internal protectors. Oh, absolutely.
To tap that audiences vehemently argue over which document is real is the ultimate proof that the story has successfully hijacked our internal systems. We become Lowen, we become part of the Crawford house.
So to summarize our positions, in light of this incredibly complex framework, I maintain that interpreting the manuscript as the truth, as the literal, terrifying confession of a destructive firefighter part, provides a necessary observable pathology. It explains the extreme, lethal actions of Verity, and it frames Jeremy's violent response as a systemic immune reaction, a punishing firefighter emerging to neutralize a real-world threat. It aligns the internal psychological chaos with the external physical reality of the tragedy. And I summarize that viewing the manuscript as a manager's creative purge and the final letter as the truth forces us to embrace a much more painful, complex reality. It reveals that human beings are deeply deceptive, that self-energy can be perfectly mimicked by dangerous, calculating manager parts, and that the good versus evil narrative we all cling to is often just a comfort blanket we use to avoid the terrifying ambiguity of human motivation.
I think we can certainly agree on the sheer architectural brilliance of the trap itself. The text demands that you reveal your own psychological framework in how you interpret the evidence. It functions as a Rorschach test for the soul.
It absolutely is. By arguing over the truth of Verity, we aren't just analyzing fictional characters. We are merely revealing which of our own internal protectors is currently holding the microphone.
And we will leave it to the listener to decide which perspective resonates with their own system. We won't declare a definitive reality today, because perhaps the only reality is the mechanism of the psychological trap itself. So we leave you with this final thought. When you are looking at the crime scene of the human mind, faced with profound, unresolvable ambiguity, which version of reality does your internal system choose to believe? The one that lets you sleep peacefully or the one that keeps you painfully awake?